Welcome to the 109th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Richard Doetsch, author of thriller novels The Thieves of Legend, The Thieves of Darkness, and many others. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Richard Doetsch, author of the new thriller novel, The Thieves of Legend. Richard is the best-selling author of 5 previous thrillers, including The Thieves of Heaven, which is currently in film development by 20th Century Fox, and The 13th Hour, which is in film development by New Line Cinema. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jeff, thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Well, can I ask you first off if you could read like the first 3 or 4 paragraphs of either the prologue or first chapter of your new novel, The Thieves of Legend?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Why don't I just get right into it?
Great.
The castle sat at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the Tyrrhenian Sea, where dark waters blended seamlessly with the nighttime sky at the horizon. Constructed of stone, brick, and granite, the structure was built directly into the cliff face and seemed to grow out of the earth as it had existed for all of time. When approached from the sea, the ancient building appeared as one with the rock, but now, in the depths of night, the glittering windows made it look more at home with the stars of the sky. Constructed in 1650 for the third Duke of Ferrante, the castle had traded hands with the rise and fall of the regime's fortunes, and had been most recently purchased by a man of vast wealth, who is rumored to have made his fortune in some unscrupulous dealings in the Far East. Michael St. Pierre stood on the edge of the structure's roof, his hand resting upon the stone battlement, feeling like a crusader who had breached the walls of Jerusalem. He took in the stars that filled the sky, the moon that had just begun its climb, the unusually heavy surf, a remnant of a forgotten storm, as it crashed like thunder against the base of the cliff face 200 feet below. Anchored a quarter mile from shore was an impressive ship, a 150-foot mega yacht. The White Sunseeker belonged to the man whose home Michael stood upon now. He had been watching it for nearly an hour. A few hundred yards to its south, a smaller yacht had arrived about 15 minutes ago. Deploying a small tender into the rough water, Michael watched as the tender came closer and closer to the dock directly below him, and after battling the heavy waves, finally managed to secure itself. Now a group of 6 well-dressed men, moving in single file, climbed the narrow, steep stairs that had been hewn out of the rock centuries earlier. They paused several times along the way to catch their breath. That's like 4 paragraphs.
Great. Well,
kind of sets the tone.
Yes. So how would you describe your new novel, The Thieves of Legend?
I would describe it as an action-adventure, thriller, romantic, historic, page-turning novel. You know what? It is an amalgam of multiple genres. You know, I love rich characters, and in creating Michael St. Pierre, he's a reformed thief. He's a man with a conscience who usually goes through moral compromise when he's drawn back into the world that he was from. But he dabbles in theft, and there's mysteries at hand, and there's a lot of world globetrotting. But at the same time, there's relationships, very strong relationships. And in this one, he has a relationship with a woman by the name of Casey Ryan. And they are each blackmailed into stealing certain pieces from different parts of China and Spain in order to save each other's lives. And it was probably as much fun as I've ever had writing a book. And, it's funny. It's finally out. It seemed like such a long journey, but now it seems like it's been out forever, even though it only came out Tuesday.
That's great. Well, you mentioned some of the international settings in the book, China, Spain, and I know there's an uncharted Pacific island. Did you do any travel specifically for research for Thieves of Legend?
I do a lot of traveling. I do adventure races around the world, and so I am always gathering, and whether I, go to Russia or Turkey or the Forbidden City or Macau, it always fills up my mind. So it doesn't necessarily come up specifically for research, but it's there historically, in a pretty big file I have in my brain.
Sure.
And the Forbidden City is just an absolutely amazing place. It is the largest palace in the world. It's so sheltered. We just, picture it from, that red wall and maybe a couple buildings that we might see. But, there are of buildings, thousands and thousands of rooms. There's subterranean, tunnels beneath. There is, history that goes back so far in China. And, even when you look at Buckingham Palace or you look at the Louvre, you look at these places, you're talking 300, 400, 500 years. But in China, we're going 600 years for the Forbidden City. We're going 4,000 years for its culture. And I always thought it was so rich, it's something I'd want to draw upon. But conversely, you have Macau and you have the modern world of the Cotai Strip, which has really become the gambling mecca of all of the world, taking over from Vegas.
Sure.
So you can kind of juxtapose those two, where you've got modern China and you've got ancient China, and then you've got the triads and everything else. And so it's always filtered in my mind. I've always found it fascinating. So I dropped it into a bucket, stirred it up, and combined some of the adventures from my life and came up with Legend.
Great. Well, you mentioned earlier that you do adventure racing. Can you talk about that a little bit? What's the adventure racing involve?
It does everything. They're all different. Whether it's as simplistic as like the Tough Mudder, which is like a 13-mile race of just obstacles, the Raid de Luce, the Expedition High, where you dropped into areas. You're climbing mountains. You are rafting. You are trekking. You're doing whatever it takes. It's a lot more than a marathon.
Sure.
And in some cases, you can skydive into a location. You can, a lot of swimming involved. And, it's against the clock. And I like to race. And I do a lot of triathlons. And it's that same sense you get in a race that I like to get into my books, into that page turning aspect, where, you've got a ticking clock, so to speak, literally in the race, but figuratively in the book. And it gives me something to draw on, and makes the reading a lot more fun.
Great. I know that you had a successful business career before you wrote your first novel and it was published. What was the path to publication like for you with that first book that you wrote?
It's interesting. I did not come to writing until my 40s. And the first thing I wrote since high school was The Thieves of Heaven. And I sat down one day, I said, I want to try to write a book. And there were a lot of things that I had looked for in bookstores and libraries. I was always a very well-read person, but I couldn't find the book I wanted to read. And so just for fun, I put pen to paper and I came up with these characters, Michael St. Pierre and, his cast of characters. And I loved it. And I gave it to my wife. She's like, you should try to get it published. And that's not what I set out to do initially. But, I sent it out. I probably got 150 rejection letters from agents, the same road everybody, takes. And my wife said one day, she's like, our friend Gene Scarlata, who owns Wamrath Bookstore in Bronxville, he's probably the most well-read guy you know. See what he thinks. If he doesn't think it's very good, then you don't have to pursue it. Gave it to him. He loved it. And the same old story. He knew an agent, gave it to the agent. The agent called, signed me up, and 2 weeks later, she gave it to her film agent. They sold it to 20th Century Fox. Then they sold it the international rights. Then they went back and came and sold them to Random House for my first two. So it's a little bit different story, but it's also got that familiarity where you've got to be tenacious. You've got to really, really never give up. I went through, I think, 2 years of rejection letters. And as all writers know, when you write the letter, you think everybody's going to come back to you. And when you get the rejection letter, you're crestfallen. The wind's knocked out of you for like a month until you got to build back up to writing your next batch of query letters. And it made me tougher. And I kept every one of them. And it's interesting. I show them to my children, who 2 of them are in their 20s, and they're coming up against their own obstacles. And I try to explain, you got to be tenacious.
Yep.
You got to be persistent. And it's funny. I stumbled into this. I love writing. And, when I did the first deal with Random House, they came back and I did a 2-book deal. And they said, so what's your second book? I was like, uh-oh. Uh-oh. Can I do this again? And I sat down. When I wrote the second one, I loved it even more. And I sold my real estate firm in 2007 and, write like crazy now. It's just
that's great.
Very glad.
So what is your writing process like? Do you have a specific workflow or time of day that you work? And also, do you outline your novels extensively, or are you more of an organic writer?
It's funny because I've only been writing since like 2005, I guess. I'm still kind of finding my way. I write every night, no matter what. And I will write usually from about 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Every day, I write a story. 1 page, not even. But I have found that it's very important to keep the creative juices going, that you come up with new stories. And those new stories generally have like a first, second, and third act. Sometimes they're just 3 lines. But by creating a new story every day, it goes into a file. And when it comes time to write a new book, I have 365 ideas to draw from. And sometimes I combine them, and sometimes, I'll modify them. But I've ended up with this large grouping of stories. And so sometimes there's an outline, and I will go and I'll outline probably 3 pages. And then I just go from there. I have a book called The 13th Hour, and it was a 1-page outline. And basically there are 13 chapters in the book. And I basically had just a line that described each chapter. And I wrote that with just that single 1 page in 30 days. And that process worked great for that. But then the Thieves books, I kind of got to give a little bit more of an outline just so I know where I'm going.
Sure.
But then I veer off from it. Mm-hmm. And as most writers know, when you have a multi-book deal, they want the outline for your next book. I finally learned that trick, that you write an outline and you give it to them and they sign off on it, and then you just go write a book. And as long as it's not that drastically off the mark, they're like, fine, this is great, But, it's interesting. You write, and when you go through it, your mind, when you're engaged on the page, can all of a sudden come up with new and fresh ideas. And so sometimes to try to throw those all into a box and plan out your next several months of writing is difficult to me.
Sure. So what are some books or authors that you've read in the past year that made an impact on you and that you would recommend?
I've always loved James Rollins. He's a good friend. He's just his books are outstanding. I went back and I read all of the James Bond books, which were just a ton of fun. And then actually read a lot of Alistair MacLean recently, and really, really, enjoyed a lot of that old style. And it's funny. I don't devote a ton of time to reading because it takes away from the writing.
Sure.
And as you might know, you start to get into somebody else's book, then you have to go back and write your own. You don't want to echo their voice in your story.
Sure.
So, I'll finish a book and I'll read like crazy. Then once I start writing, I kind of keep away from somebody else's just so I don't spoil my own voice.
Sure. Well, I know that earlier you talked about being tenacious. What other advice would you have for aspiring writers?
I think for any writer, what I mentioned before was writing an idea down every day, disengaging from what you're writing at the moment and opening up your mind, because we're creative. But once you're into the book, you kind of have these self-imposed walls. To get away from that just for 15 minutes, a half hour, and dream something, and do that every day, it kind of, they say a writer should write every day. I think a storyteller should tell a new story every day. And by doing that, when it comes time to write your next novel, you're going to have a lot more ideas to draw from. And each day you have different inspirations, and it could be, romantic. It could be action inspiration. It could be touching. It could be Christmas. It could be all these different things. By writing that each day, you're going to draw inspiration from yourself when you open up that file. So I think it's very important to be a storyteller every day, not just somebody's putting pen to paper.
That's great. That's great. I think that's unique advice, and I think it's good. What are you working on now? Have you started working on another novel?
I've got I have 3 things in the works. I've got a couple movies that are moving towards production, and one of them it's actually being announced on Monday. I've adapted the screenplay for I've adapted the Thieves of Darkness with a gentleman, a great screenwriter by the name of Shane Salerno, who had Savages came out this summer, and he wrote Armageddon and all these other things. And he went and bought the Thieves of Darkness, and we wrote the script together. And so that's taken up a little bit of time. And I've written a screenplay, which I can't reveal the title of because it's very telling.
Sure.
And just finished that up. And also just am in the process of selling a screenplay called Magicos. I've almost done with another Thieves book, and then I have a book called Sacred. So I've always got something going, and I write a lot, and I find that I could never do just one book a year. That would make me nuts.
Sure.
Got to do a few.
Great. Well, where can people find you online?
There's 2 addresses. There's richarddoetsch.com, and Doetsch is Doetsch, which is a mouthful. But they can go to thethieves.org, easier to spell, easier to remember, and they can, see everything there. I do the Facebook thing and the Twitter thing, and but I'm pretty active on my own website.
Sure.
And it's great because you get to interact with your readers and get that feedback that you didn't get in the past.
That's great, and I'll have links to those in the show notes as well if people want to check your site out.
Sure.
And great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Richard Doetsch, author of the new thriller novel, The Thieves of Legend, available in bookstores now. So check it out. Richard, thanks for doing the interview.
Jeff, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great holiday.
Almost 90% of women have cellulite. And guess what? It's not their fault. We don't choose cellulite, but we can choose a different way to treat it. Meet Quo, collagenase Clostridium histolyticum, AAES, the first and only FDA-approved prescription injectable for moderate to severe cellulite in the buttocks of adult women. This non-surgical treatment is injected by an aesthetic specialist in 10 minutes or less. Individual results may vary. Do not receive if you are allergic to any collagenase or ingredients in Quo, or have an infection at the treatment site. May cause serious side effects, allergic reactions including anaphylaxis, and injection site bruising. Seek medical help right away for any signs of allergic hypersensitivity. Tell your doctor about all your medical conditions if you have a bleeding condition or take medicine that prevents clotting. Most common side effects include bruising, pain, hardness, itching, redness, discoloration, swelling, and warmth at the injection site. Ask your doctor about all possible side effects and for product information. If you're ready to get to the bottom of your cellulite, learn more and find a specialist at Quo.com.